Jacob Brunton is going to be leading our discussion today on epistemology for Christian life. We're going to focus a lot on Q&A today. So that means if you right now would take a minute, think through what are your biggest questions first of all, for us, it's an ask me anything about our epistemology, but also just what are some topics that you think are worthy of discussion in the field of epistemology. Jacob, let's start with, can you outline a little bit where we've come from the last two sessions that we've done this? What are some of the topics we've covered? This will help people think through what are some of the questions they should be thinking of.
Yeah, so we've covered a lot about sort of the basics of Christian epistemology and trying to sift through some of the points of confusion that a lot of Christians have when it comes to epistemology. For instance, a lot of Christians think that reason is in conflict with faith. And a lot of those same Christians might think that reason is in conflict with revelation, or at least in competition. And so we started off talking about what is the difference between reason and faith, what is the difference between reason and revelation, and how do those things integrate with each other rather than conflict or compete with each other. And that was one of the really important things that I think is important for all Christians to understand, because once you get those issues settled, a lot of the motivation for some of the what I think are aberrant Christian epistemologies that are out there today that are really popular, those views rely on confusion regarding those fundamental issues of reason, revelation, and faith. And so if you can get those things kind of settled and see how they interplay with each other rather than conflict with each other, then there's a lot less motivation to be tempted to embrace one of those sort of aberrant Christian epistemologies that's anti-reason, and it becomes a lot clearer how we can be pro-reason in our Christian faith. So that was sort of the emphasis of the last two videos, and we went through a number of details regarding that. We haven't gone real deep into alternative views of epistemology, so like presuppositionalism or reformed epistemology, or just other sorts of what I would consider fideism. And we haven't really gone real deep into our own epistemology, which could be called classicalism or classical foundationalism. And so I'm really happy to go in any of those directions or all of those directions based on what you guys think would be most valuable for you at this stage. I'm assuming that you've watched the previous videos. If you haven't, that's fine. But based on what we've already covered, I'd love to hear from you guys on what direction you would like to go. Do you want to discuss and have classical foundationalism be explained, sort of our positive epistemology? Do you want to delve into those epistemological views that we disagree with in Christianity that are really popular right now? Do you want to analyze how they compare with each other? I'd love to go in any of those directions.
Good starting point was Greg sent in a question early, and he said, let's talk about the matrix question. Throughout philosophy's history, people have been asking these questions. How do we know that we know things? How do we know that we're not being deceived? Is it legitimate to think that there is a physical world around us? And different people answer that question differently. One of the questions that you face is, how can you know that there are other minds? Those types of things. Do you have any just kind of general level approach to those kinds of questions, Jacob?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's important to see what the motivation is behind those, what they're objecting to. Mm-hmm. So those questions or problems are objecting to the idea that we can have knowledge of the things that we want to have knowledge of by reason alone, or by reason applied to sense perception. Those are, answering those things are the types of things that we're not supposed to be able to answer simply by applying our reasoning minds to the created order. So that's the idea behind them, and the motive is, or the upshot is, you're supposed to realize that and then think, okay, well, then either I should be a skeptic and doubt that we can know anything for sure, or at least that we can know those types of basic things like the world exists or other minds exist. So you can become skeptical about those things, or you can embrace a really lax view of epistemology that just allows you to affirm those things, even though you don't have a good argument or reason for them. So do you see what the upshot is there? It's supposed to be one or the other. You either have to reject the knowledge of the basic thing, or you have to embrace a wider view of epistemology that allows you to include that, but it also ends up allowing you to include almost anything else arbitrary. So that's kind of the upshot. And I think the best way to address those is to realize that there's a moral sense to the way we use our minds. And a lot of contemporary epistemologists and philosophers wouldn't agree with that. But I think as Christians, we should. I think there's really good support throughout the Bible and throughout church history to the idea that there's a moral sense, or there are moral implications for how we use our minds. If you pay attention and focus on the truth, that's a good thing. And if you see the truth but then hate it, maybe because it exposes your sin, so the light was in the world, but we hated the light because we loved the darkness of our own hearts, right? That's evil. It's evil to evade. It's evil to shy away from the truth, and it's a good thing to engage with the truth and focus your mind. And so there's a moral aspect, and the way that gets applied to these questions of other minds and like the matrix objection is the conclusions you come to with your mind need to be in line with the evidence and the reason that you have. And the conclusions you come to aren't just positive beliefs, but they're also doubt. So if you doubt something, you should have reason to doubt it. Just like if you believe something, you should have reason to believe it. And what those objections are trading off of is the idea that it's okay to doubt anything, whether you've got reason to doubt it or not. But it's not okay to believe anything, whether you've got reason to believe it or not. And so it's this double standard when it comes to belief and doubt. And I think what we need to do is reject that double standard and understand that, no, you've got to have a reason to doubt something, just like you've got to have a reason to believe it. And then when you come at it like that, you got to ask, do we really have reason to doubt that the physical world actually exists? Do we have reason to believe that we're in the matrix? No. Do I have reason to doubt that other minds exist? Sure, I can't take another mind and put it on the microscope. But then again, I'm not an empiricist, so why does that matter? I've got really good reason to believe that other minds exist. I've got really good reason to believe that the external world exists, that I'm not in the matrix. And is it possible that I'm wrong? Sure, maybe. It might be possible. But do I have reason to think that I'm wrong? And the answer is no, I don't have any reason to think that I'm wrong. And so it's incumbent on me not to think that I'm wrong if I've got no reason to think that I'm wrong about that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that really does. And I was going to say that probably is a good segue into the discussion that we were going to aim for, which is on first-person discernibility as a standard for justifying knowledge. Let's go that direction. And then maybe just a couple minutes just so people understand what the term means. And then let's open it to questions. We've got a lot of people here, a lot of combined wisdom between us. I think we should open up the floor. But can you explain that term, first-person discernibility?
Yeah, so this is a term that I'm introducing in my talks about epistemology, and I recently presented a paper on it at the American Academy of Religions Regional Conference, and I'll be revising the paper and publishing it on academia.edu and trying to advance it a little bit more. But the reason I came up with this term is because the common terms in epistemology, like knowledge, justification, warrant, there's been a lot of redefinitions going on with those things. And it's created a lot of confusion. And so I was trying to come up with a unique term that gets at what I think is really essential when it comes to epistemology. and so that's why I came up with this term, first person discernibility. And so the first part of it, first person, emphasizes the fact that I think the fundamental issue in epistemology is, do you have good reason for the beliefs that you hold? Not so. One of the emphases in epistemology today is sort of the second or third person evaluation of other people. So the emphasis is on, can I say that he's being irrational, or can he say that I'm being irrational? And that's sort of the emphasis in contemporary epistemological discussions. But I want to say, I don't care if someone else can say I'm being irrational. And I don't care so much if I can say that they're being irrational. I want to know, am I being rational? I want to know, how can I assign an epistemic status to my own beliefs? How can I figure out whether or not I'm being rational or irrational in a given situation? And so that's why I say first person. And then the discernibility is discerning whether or not I'm being rational. Discerning, so having standards of rationality, having certain criteria for what it means to be rational and what it means to have knowledge of the real world, and then being able to apply those standards to myself, regardless of what other people might be able to say about my current belief status.
Mm-hmm. Jacob, I was going to say, there's in the scripture, there is something that may support this idea of first person discernibility. I'm going to read you guys John 20, 30 through 31. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So that's the first person discernibility right there, I think. I think that it's saying these are written that you may believe. And so it's facts, presentation of facts, sensory information, reasoning with people, bringing them to the point where they individually are capable of knowing that this is true, knowing that it is true. And are they using their reason, or are they using their autonomous reason? And that was the other question that Greg brought up, was he says, how do we know when you're just biased versus how when you are being objective? How do you know when you have certainty? Can you trust your own mind? And that's the question that is important, because throughout the history of Christianity, one of the biggest critiques that people have had against Christianity is, you could just believe whatever you want, and how are you going to know this or that? And Christians, by and large, especially leading up to Immanuel Kant and past Immanuel Kant, have defaulted on that question, and they've actually conceded the point to the subjectivists. And unfortunately, that was a bad decision. We don't need to do that.
Yeah. Is it all right if I clarify the question?
Yeah, go ahead. Great.
Yeah, please.
Awesome. So it was a question that I've kind of been going back and forth for quite a while. I think listening to a lot of what you've said, Jacob, and talking to Cody a little bit has helped to clarify it. But I looked around online. It looks like there's other people who have similar questions. And I think you're kind of answering it, but so you look at today's political arena, for example, and you see a lot of irrational claims. You see people claiming that Ben Carson's a white supremacist, and he's about as black as you can get, or saying that Ben Shapiro is a neo-Nazi. And so people have these irrational beliefs that are totally bonkers. And it's basically millions of people following these ideas. And so we can look at this and say this is irrational. But then, flip that around. How do I know that me with my Christian and conservative beliefs, how do I know that I'm not being irrational? I try to step outside of the echo chamber, so I definitely will read both sides of any issue. But then that kind of, brought up the matrix question of, how do I know I'm not fooling myself? When you're in a dream, you think everything is rational. You think this is the way the world is. And I'm sorry, there was one other point of clarification for the other side of that question, but I can't remember what it was. I apologize.
That's right. So basically what you're asking is, how can I have first person discernibility?
Yes.
A lot of other epistemologies would say, Well, as long as everybody else thinks you're being rational, you're fine. You're being rational. As long as the crowd or the tribe around you thinks you're being rational, then you're being rational. And you're saying, well, I don't care what the tribe thinks about me. I don't care what other people think about me or what other tribes think about me. I want to know, how can I figure out whether I'm being rational or not? And that's what I'm trying to get at when I talk about first-person discernibility, which is something I think that a lot of contemporary thinkers in epistemology have sort of dropped the ball on. It's really just essentially the question of, how can I figure out whether or not I'm being rational? And the answer is, you've got to identify criteria for rationality, and then test your ideas and your thoughts and your reasoning process against those criteria. And the ultimate criteria are logic and sense perception. And everything else gets built up from there. And it's a really complex story on how it gets built up from there. But to make it as basic as possible, test everything against logic and sense perception. Can you ground your beliefs in logic and in observable reality? And that might be really difficult. And you'll probably need to enlist the help of a lot of people who have done the thinking already, and kind of read them, but don't read them mindlessly. Critically evaluate their arguments. There are a lot of really good arguments out there for a lot of things. For the small things like, is the pencil actually bent when it goes into water? And if not, then why does it look like it? Well, there's a lot of good scientific analysis of that, all the way up to, what is justice? Is justice what the leftists say when they talk about social justice? Is justice what the conservatives say when they talk about capitalism? What is justice, and how do you figure it out? There are good arguments for that, and you've got to analyze those arguments by using reason and testing it against those standards, ultimately, of logic and sense perception.
Jacob, I was going to ask, the standards of logic and sense perception, do we have any biblical basis at all for using those two?
I mean, it's sort of implicitly assumed all throughout Scripture, in the constant appeals to miracles as confirmation that it's God speaking, and not just Moses' opinion, or that Jesus is who he says he is, and not just some random hippie street preacher. So you've got miracles as an appeal to evidence all over Scripture, but then you also have God appealing to people, come and reason. Let's reason. Or you've got Abraham, the father of faith, in Hebrews 11, where it says that he reasoned that God was able to raise Isaac from the dead. I think Abraham was engaging in natural theology there, and thinking about the nature of God, thinking about, well, he created the entire universe. I'm pretty sure he can raise my son from the dead. He's also promised me that my son is going to bear many fruit. He's going to bear nations, and that hasn't happened yet. And God has such a character that he can't default on his promises. So I've got really good reason to think that God can raise Isaac from the dead, and that he will raise Isaac from the dead. So and that's what Hebrews 11 is getting at when it says that he reasoned that he was able to raise Isaac from the dead. And that was his faith, by the way. His faith was a result of him reasoning about the nature of God in such a way that enabled him to act with assurance based on those promises and what he knew about God.
Yeah, and he knew about God because of the created order existing, testifies to God, and then also God had interacted with him in the form of like a burning pot and fire, and he had seen various miracles at this time in his life. So he had justification from his senses and from reason for that belief. But I was also thinking of Luke 12:56. Jesus calls the Pharisees hypocrites because they refused to use their reasoning to realize that he was from God.
Yeah, to read the signs of the times. So what Jesus rebukes the Pharisees for, or it's not just the Pharisees actually. It's also fishermen. It was he says you can look at the skies and say, I forget the colors, but say it's red, and it's gonna be stormy, or the sky's blue and it's gonna be nice and calm. So basically what he's saying is you observe and then you infer from a principle, like a syllogism, to a conclusion. When the sky is this way, it's going to be stormy. Look, the sky is this way, therefore it's going to be stormy. And then in the converse, when the sky is this way, it's not going to be stormy. The sky is this way, so it's not going to be stormy. He's saying you can reason just fine. You can observe and make inferences just fine. And yet you don't observe and make inferences about the signs of the times. And so you're adulterous. Mm-hmm. You're hypocrites and adulterous. You're evil. And that gets back to what we were talking about earlier with there is a moral dimension to the way we use our reason. Jesus rebuked them because they could reason just fine. They were choosing not to engage their reasoning when it came to observing the signs of the times and understanding what they meant.
I noticed, Christopher, you have yourself unmuted. Was there something you wanted to add at this point?
Yeah, I've been thinking a little bit about the classical approach in philosophy, thinking classic in terms of, Socratic or Plato, those guys. There's a relationship between reality and reason, as well as a relationship between reality, reason, and ethics. Those things work together. So when we think about the question was raised earlier, what is, the nature of logic and how does that relate to Scripture? Well, the word logic has its root in the word logos. Logos is the ordering principle of reality in Greek, according to the classical Greeks. And the logos is identified as Jesus, as Christ, by John in the beginning of John's Gospel. So the ordering principle of reality is the thing that we're participating in when we reason. So it corresponds. There's a correspondence between our ability to think reasonably or logically and the created order. That's how we can justify that. So what we're entering into when we reason is something a lot bigger than our minds. We're entering in some sense, to the thinking of God himself. This is what Einstein was kind of tongue-in-cheek getting at when he said, I want to think God's thoughts. The rest are details. I don't know if you guys ever heard that.
Yeah.
Little quip. But the idea is that we're entering into the thinking of God when we reason. And when we go astray, when we reason incorrectly, we're departing. When we're reasoning correctly, we're thinking God's thoughts after him. So it's not something that's just happening in our heads that gets us out of the subjective. This is a sense in which our heads are entering into something bigger than themselves. And even our ability to, and there's, of course, the connection between language and reason that's implied by the word logos. It can be translated either way, as reason or words or word. So in a sense, we are kind of, you can say, baptized into reason by being given a language to use, and we acquire language as we interact with other people. And so consequently, we're already outside of ourselves just when we start talking. If we were just left to ourselves, we wouldn't have the power to reason or to talk. So we're part of something much bigger when we're reasoning. Whether we're reasoning well or not, fairly, or whether we have all the information. The Apostle Paul talks about the fact that we, prophecy in part because we don't know everything, but we can know many things, and the things that have been disclosed to us we can speak to. So anyway, those are just a few thoughts I thought I'd throw in to get some folks to respond to those ideas.
Any response to what Christopher is saying from anyone else besides me and Jacob?
I'll just mention that absolutely amen, and that's why I think it's really helpful and important to understand the relationship between revelation and reason. What you were talking about is God's revelation, particularly general revelation. And I think that's what Paul is referring to in Romans 1. Revelation isn't just words on a page. Revelation is all of truth. all of reality. Everything that is true, every true proposition is revealed by God, by the mind of God. And reason is our process of retracing God's reasoning, or God's mind, God's truth that he's revealed to us in the world, in order to think his thoughts after him, like Christopher said. And so it's not the way that most Christians today paint it, where I'm taking my reason and I'm pulling myself up by the bootstraps, and it's all this subjective, internal, and I'm going to build my ladder of reason up to God. God's way up there, and I'm going to get up there on my own steam. I don't need him. I can do it on my own. This caricature of sort of Western individualism, which is a whole nother topic we can talk about sometime. But that's not what the picture is. The picture is God has revealed all of this truth to us. God built the ladder, and us engaging in reason is us climbing his ladder, which he's commanded us to. He built it for us to climb it. When we reason about reality and do it rightly, we are submitting to his truth. We're submitting to his revelation in order to glorify him in it. And the only alternative to submitting to his revelation with your reason is to reject his revelation and float by your emotions, which is going to get you to the point where you end up accepting ideas that are contrary to his revelation, contrary to his truth. So you've only got two alternatives here. You can either use your reason to submit yourself to the truth of God that he's revealed in all of reality, or you can reject reason as a means of knowledge, and you will end up ultimately being at war with his reality. Those are your only two options.
Was there something, Trey, that you wanted to add at that point? Here, I'll unmute you. Oh,
I'm sorry. I was
there you are.
I was looking up something just there, and I got off this page. Well, I was just kind of directly or generally in the direction of what Greg was asking, and I think Jacob brought up that every inquiry that we have must be based upon logic or reason and sense experience. And the problem with that is, of course, logic brings certainty, because if you give the premises that are given in the argument, they naturally flow, like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, and therefore Socrates is mortal. But we've got to use our sense perception in order to relate to the world around us. And the problem with using our sense perception is that our senses trick us. As Jacob brought up, the pencil in the water will bend. And so it's difficult for us to sometimes understand how we can come to certainty in this world in which we have. And from my perspective, I don't think it's possible for us as contingent creatures to have absolute certainty about anything. That's why it's called justified true belief. But I do think that we would all hold to the idea that we are looking for the correspondence theory of truth. Would you agree with that, Jacob?
I kind of object to the idea of calling it a theory of truth. The correspondence theory of truth is the only meaningful definition of truth. But yeah, right. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, and so what we're trying to do is we're trying to find what is the reality around us and how do we relate to us, and that starts with ourselves. And so if we don't grant logic or the law of non-contradiction, there's no way to filter that information. And if we don't grant sense perception, even though we make mistakes, even though our sense perception tricks us a lot and we're always having to change it, that's why science is always changing, because it can't bring certainty. It's the only connection that we have to this world around us. And so that's all we've got, okay? And so although we cannot have absolute certainty, that's only something God can have. For someone to have certainty, they've got to know everything. We don't have that, and so that's where faith comes in. And this is what I tell my skeptical friends. They always say, well, I don't believe in faith. It's like, yeah, you do. It's not a matter of whether we have faith or not have faith. It's whether we have good faith or bad faith. Can we justify, can we think through and reason the conclusions that we are coming to? And for example, the atheists cannot do that. They must rely on really blind faith to come to the conclusions they have. Most specifically, you're talking about ethics too, I think, Jacob. And for example, with ethics, as it results to logic, every ethical decision we make is founded upon the premise that existence is special. And if you don't have an efficient cause to reality, in other words, someone to purpose it, to say that it's important, there is no purpose whatsoever. So the atheist cannot justify himself whatsoever. And yet we can. But like I said, we're always going to be on faith. So Hebrews 11:6 says, "For without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and he is a rewarder of those who seek him." That verse, in my view, is not speaking of believing whether God exists or not. It's rather believing in God's goodness and that he rewards those who seek him, because Romans 1 and 2 say that we already know him. There's no question about it. We all know that there's right and there's wrong, and we all know that we're not self-existent, that this is a created order, had to be made by something. So faith for us is not, it's more trusting in God's goodness. Even though we see evil around us, we are clinging to him and understanding him. But we can have a way, as Jacob eloquently pointed out, to be able to find things, to justify them in our view, but we can never have complete, absolute certainty, because we are dependent creatures and our senses are always tricking us.
Yeah, I don't like to talk a whole lot about certainty when it comes to epistemology, because there's some vagueness around that term, and there are different things you can mean. There's sort of a psychological sense of certainty, like a feeling of certainty. There's a more strong epistemic sense of certainty in which, you can't possibly be wrong. So, like if it's a necessary truth, then it's certain, so there's a little bit of confusion. So in most discussions, I don't really emphasize certainty, because I don't think it's super important. I think the important thing is following where reason leads you. So, maybe you've got a small defeater or a small reason to doubt something, but you've got lots of really good reasons not to doubt it. Well, you go in the direction that all of the evidence points to, or all the reasons point to. And when I say evidence here, I'm speaking broadly. I'm not just talking about, physical evidence that you can look at. I'm talking about, arguments, inferences to the best explanation, things like that. That there's a whole host of things that fit into reason or evidence in terms of what you should follow with your beliefs. I think you're right that this plays a big role in faith. I also don't know that I would say that everyone exercises faith with every one of their beliefs, at least with those beliefs that aren't necessary truths, because it seems like the Bible reserves the word faith for something a little bit more robust than that. And I've got an article on this on our website, on christianintellectual.com. Maybe Cody can post it in our notes here. But what I argue in there, and I'm not real set on this, but I think it's going in the direction that the Bible goes, is that there's one more aspect to faith in addition to believing where the reason's leading you to believe, and that is, and in addition to loving God, or loving what you see about the reason, and that is doing so in the face of obstacles or reasons to doubt, or seemingly significant reasons to doubt, and holding on to that because you've got greater reason to believe it, and then acting on that. So there's a lot of aspects that I think go into what the Bible refers to as faith. There's an epistemic aspect, there's a value aspect that you mentioned, Trey, and that Piper really emphasizes. I really appreciate that. And there's an action aspect of acting on it because of the belief and the conviction that it gives you. So I'd recommend reading that article, but that's a really good discussion. And it's really important for us to understand how faith relates to this issue of epistemology.
The article is called "Faith is More Than Trust," and you can find that at christianintellectual.com/faith is more than trust. Hey, Greg, I see you had unmuted. Was there something at this point you wanted to add in there?
Yeah, I think that I think that Jacob has explained this stuff well, and like I said, I've seen other people have that same kind of concern. The Matrix question. Am I just a brain in a jar, or what if evolution or Islam or whatever is true, and I'm just fooling myself? And I think a good summary of this is, use your eyes and use your brain rather than letting your emotions rule you. So like I see other people who are holding to these, some bizarre ideas out there, saying Ben Carson's a white supremacist or whatever. And the more you look into the facts, the more you look into the logic. Often, like, these are people who just don't know what they're talking about, or people who are intentionally deceiving themselves. Like, I got into a discussion with somebody who's the top evolutionary geneticist on the planet, and he was, dismissing people who object to this idea, who's dismissing intelligent design people, saying, oh, well, they deny that species change. And I was like, well, that's not true. That's not what they say. And I think he knew that too. He, because I pointed it out to him, but he still would dig his heels in, and he was saying stuff about his opponents that simply were not true. So, I mean, I think when you look around at the world, if we're opening ourselves up and we're hearing all the different arguments, it talks about in Proverbs, hearing both sides of a debate, and, we're not just, putting ourselves in our own little box. You talk about being autonomous, but we're looking out at the world, and we really are collecting all the facts and really are looking at all the arguments as much as a human being possibly can. And position B is just coming up dry, then I think you can but position A has, good evidence for it. Then I think that there does come to a point where you have to say, hey, we have all of the evidence in the world to say that the world exists. I have all of the evidence in the world to say that the world is created. And I have all of the evidence in the world to say that Jesus, rose from the dead, as much as you can from a historical perspective, at least. So I think at some point you have to say, hey, I can either believe the evidence, or I can believe there's some giant machine out there called the Matrix that has created this elaborate conspiracy, but then to what end? Why? And, why is the world so, as we see it, so coherent? At some point you have to be able to trust your eyes and trust your own mind. And even a dream doesn't have this kind of coherency.
Ultimately, it comes down to we have to take personal responsibility for what we believe is true. And that's going to be the case even if we happened to be in something like a matrix. We have to take responsibility for the facts as they are presented to us. And I think, Greg, one of the things you pointed out earlier was this comparison between following the facts versus following emotions. And emotions cannot be a standard of what is true or false, except for in questions about what is my emotional state, then they are. But I think that personal responsibility is something that Jacob and I want to emphasize a lot with that first person discernibility. And that's the issue is what is true? What should I believe is true based on the information available to me? And am I truly seeking the truth? Objectivity is an important concept. And Greg, you're asking about that. Objectivity is when by your free will, by your choice, your volitional choice, you decide that you want to stick to the facts of reality and you want to follow a method that is designed to help you stick to those facts. And that method needs to include being open to observation, as well as being open to using your logic, so that if you observe 3 different facts and 2 of them seem to contradict, then you use logic to figure out what maybe you've misunderstood one of them. So
can I throw in one more thing? Mm-hmm. Also, Jacob, I think that I really appreciate that obviously you've done all this studying with philosophy and everything, and you're able to put these ideas into words much more eloquently than I can. But it's definitely helping me to hear this. But somebody mentioned something about science, and I think that as science progresses, it's kind of interesting because a lot of what we see as advances in science, quite often it's not that, oh, well, we observe all these new facts that contradict old facts. It's that we have the old facts and we might interpret it one particular way. And, it might be a way that's totally rational, but it is an inference. We're putting together pieces of a puzzle. We might say, oh, well, this is one picture, and then we get more pieces and turns out it's a different picture. But a lot of times it really does take a paradigm shift. Like it does take, not being, with scientists, I find it amazing. Like, well, people will get really stuck in one way of thinking and get stuck with like the theory of ether or whatever. And then it can be difficult to break out of that and difficult to say, hey, here's new evidence or here's a new argument. And being able to step outside of the echo chamber. As Proverbs 18:17 says, the first to present his case seems right till another comes forward and question him. So being able to be open to the Newtons, the Einsteins, the Galileos, and saying, hey, is there another way of looking at the same data? But then again, I think science is usually dealing with stuff that's pretty out there, pretty esoteric. It's not, does this bird in front of me exist? This bird in front of me is giving me all the appearance of existing. It's not glitching out like the Matrix might do once in a while. And it's not fuzzy like in a dream. So, you can, at some point, you have all the internal consistency to say this bird is real.
Yeah. I wanted to give Leland a chance. He had raised his hand a while back. Leland, do you have anything you wanted to add here? I'm going to unmute you now. Okay, you're good. Oh, Leland?
Leland?
Hear me?
I hear you.
Hello. Okay. Probably can't see me because I had to find a little corner somewhere where I could get good Wi-Fi signal.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Two things, because you guys over the past 5, 10, 15 minutes have covered a couple different topics. I just had two things I wanted to share or either ask, whatever. Now, the first is you're talking about certainty. And I think somebody made the statement, or perhaps I misunderstood them, is, we can't really be certain about anything. I think 100%, and I don't know that's necessarily true. So German philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein categorizes statements into three categories. You have analytic assertions, you have synthetic assertions, and you have technically meaningless assertions. Analytic assertions are true 100% of the time. They're absolute. And the two types of statements that fall into that category would be mathematical and by definition. Statements are either true or false by definition. Or again, 2 + 2 is always 4, period. That's absolutely certain. Other types of synthetic assertions are assertions that can be, evidence can be brought to bear in support of them. It's not 100%, but you have reason to believe, and that's what you guys were kind of talking about, I think. So I'm not really sure where you guys were, and I can't remember the name of the person who was talking about that. I'm not really exactly sure where he was going with that, but that was just, and that might just be splitting hairs. But I mean, I think that's kind of important because there are some things that you can't absolutely know. And of course, technically meaningless assertions are no evidence can be brought to bear one way or the other. For example, you take a claim of Islam that the Archangel Gabriel, gave his revelation to the Prophet Muhammad on a mountaintop somewhere. There were no witnesses whatsoever. There's no evidence one way or the other to say it either did happen or it didn't happen. It's technically meaningless. Most religious assertions fall into that category. And I think Christianity is kind of the exception to that, because wherever Christ performed miracles, he performed them in the presence of both protagonists and antagonists. When Christ is kind of confirmed by God, who says, at the Mount of Transfiguration, and he says, this is my son with whom I'm well pleased. So at least there's, testimonial evidence that Christ was the Son of God, because it happened in the presence of both Peter and John, if I'm not mistaken. So I agree with what you guys are saying. I don't know if that's necessarily splitting hairs, but I think that, I don't know that it's necessarily right to say that nothing is certain. In that sense. Hold on one second. I apologize.
I was going to chime in about what you said, Leland. I think on the concept of certainty, maybe we want to distinguish between the idea that I'm going to say something and I could not possibly be wrong, versus the idea of I'm going to say something and everything that I know of so far supports the truth of that statement to the point where it would be justified by various standards which have to be outlined through the entire subject of epistemology. I would be justified in saying that this is the case. Now, so it's my perspective, which I would disagree with what Trey had said earlier just slightly. It's possible for me to be certain and for me to be wrong. But then I've defined the concept of certainty slightly differently. And so in my concept, you would not have to be omniscient and infallible in order to say I am certain, but then I'm using the term just slightly differently. And so there's still a valid, a different concept for the kind of certainty, the kind of knowledge that God has, because he is infallible and he is omniscient. And Greg, you were going to ask a question about clarifying. You were going to say,
Sure.
What is a technically meaningless statement? So that just would be, something that is self-contradictory. Right, Jacob?
Yeah, so let me just back up real quick and give a big picture analysis of where we're at here. I think it'd be good for us to recognize that, so we've got a basic epistemological view that can, broadly speaking, be called classicalism or classical foundationalism, where we view logic and sense perception as the ultimate criteria. Now, within that, there's all kinds of debate to be had regarding what is certainty, can it be obtained, what are necessary truths, what are analytic truths, what are synthetic truths, what is meaning, conceptual meaning versus other types of meaning, things like that. So there's lots of really good discussions to be had within the context of affirming what I'll just call classical foundationalism. But the fact that those discussions arise, I don't think are reasons to doubt classical foundationalism. I think there's really good reason to hold to classical foundationalism, and then within that context, have these discussions. And these are good discussions to have, and you don't have to come down with a really solid pat answer on any one of these given complex issues, because these are fairly complex issues, in order to affirm classical foundationalism, as opposed to something like presuppositionalism or reformed epistemology or just flat out skepticism or whatever the case may be. So that's a helpful way to address these issues. Regarding technically meaningless statements, I want to be careful by classifying things as technically meaningless or arbitrary. I want to make sure that I'm not ruling out something that from investigation that might have a reason to investigate. So, for instance, with Muhammad and his claim, or Joseph Smith and his claim, he never let anybody see the golden plates and things like that. I don't want to say, well, there's no conceptual meaning to that whatsoever, so let's not even investigate it. Because I think at the very least you can say, well, Joseph Smith can be taken as testimony for this. He's giving a testimony. And maybe there's very little weight to his testimony. And there probably is, especially given the fact that he was a fabricator and a liar to begin with, and the fact that Muhammad was a murderer. So there's very little value to his testimony. But I don't want to say that it's meaningless. Like the words that he's putting together, the propositions that he's giving, they have meaning. They have content. We know what he's communicating. We know what he's claiming. That there's meaning there. So there's a difference between whether or not something's meaningful and whether or not we should give it any consideration, whether or not we should count it as being justified or having any sort of epistemic status in terms of whether or not we should pursue it. So I'd want to draw that distinction, just because I don't want to be in the business of ruling out things from the realm of investigation prior to even investigating them. I'd want to at least say, sure, let's investigate it, Joseph Smith. Do you have anything else to go off of other than your testimony? No? Okay, well then we're not going to believe that. Like, you got to give us more than just you saw this, especially with this exaggerated thing, and especially since you're a liar, things like that.
Jacob, on the idea of a statement that is technically meaningless, it might just be something as simple as like asking what color is time.
Yeah.
Or, like it's just things that there's a category error that makes it impossible to have a coherent grammar.
Yeah. So if it's something like that, where it's not that it doesn't have enough evidence or it doesn't have very much evidence, but it's that it just really doesn't make sense. Like, even if there was evidence for it, we wouldn't be able to comprehend it because there's an internal contradiction, or there's a category error, like you said. If I said gobbledygook blue 2, and I said, now why don't you believe that? Well, there's no meaning there. There's nothing to believe, right? So I would say those are meaningless statements, but I wouldn't want to say something's meaningless simply because we don't have a very good amount of evidence for it. I'd want to dismiss it on the basis that it doesn't have good evidence, not on the basis that it's quote unquote meaningless.
I think, Jacob, what's at stake in that discussion is when we talk to atheists, very often they will say, well, you're making a claim about a miracle, but a miracle is just, it's an extraordinary claim. I need extraordinary evidence. I'm not even going to consider it unless you show me extraordinary evidence. And I think the right answer to those atheists is to say the existence of the church, the documents that we have attesting to Jesus, these are extraordinary evidence and they're worthy of consideration. And so we want to be able to take that position so that we can distinguish ourselves from that criticism.
Yeah, what they're doing there is they're begging the question. That they're saying, oh, that's so outlandish that I don't even have to consider the evidence, so I'm not going to. And I want to be careful that we don't take that same position with other issues or other propositions. So I want to say we should always be open to the evidence, and then just be honest. Hey, there's not much evidence here.
Mm-hmm. Leland, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you again. Did you want to add anything at this point? Oh, there we go. Unmute.
Okay. So I did have something else to bring up, but it's not really as important. I feel like myself and Jacob here defining a technically meaningless assertion maybe a little bit differently. And maybe, again, I'm splitting hairs. Please correct me if you think so. So I take the definition from, again, the German philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. The work that I think he outlines all this stuff, if I remember correctly, is the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. Okay, that's where I get my definition. And the definition of the technically meaningless assertion is not saying that there's no value or there's no meaning in the statement that Muhammad receives his revelation from the Archangel Gabriel, the messenger of Allah or whatever, right? The statement is that if there's no evidence to support it, okay, then that makes it a technically meaningless statement. So if I don't have any evidence, if there are no witnesses, if there's no any kind of documentary evidence or whatever else, scientific, historical, whatever, some kind of corroborating piece of information, that doesn't mean that the statement isn't worth investigating. I think the fact that Islam, next to Christianity, is one of the biggest religions, or is the next biggest religion in the world, is enough reason to investigate the claim itself. But in order to have any kind of rational belief in Muhammad receiving in his revelation from the Archangel Gabriel, there has to be some kind of corroborating evidence, either for that or something else that has happened that would give reason to believe that also happened.
Sure. So there's a few things.
It's not a statement saying that there's no value.
Yeah, there's a few things. So one, I would just want to disagree with Wittgenstein there and say I don't want to call that a meaningless statement, because there is meaning to it. We understand what Muhammad's claiming, and we don't have very good reason to believe it. So instead of calling it a meaningless statement, I'd want to just say you don't have very good evidence, and that's why I'm rejecting it. But I can see why he might want to call it a meaningless statement. I don't want to quibble over the semantics. I think another issue, though, is even if all we had was Muhammad's word, I don't want to say that therefore we have no evidence, because we have his testimony. If I came to Cody and I said, "Hey, I just saw this, fill in the blank, whatever extravagant thing," and he had nothing else to go on other than what I'm saying. He's got evidence. He's got my testimony. And then the question is, well, is there any weight to my testimony? Do I have a history of lying? Do I have a history of telling the truth about things like this? Maybe there's a way for him to investigate it in a secondary manner. Maybe there's not. But there's still the fact that that's still evidence. It may not be very good evidence. And you're going to bring in criteria to judge whether or not it's good evidence. But I think you would still call that, just one person's testimony, it's still evidence. And a different question is, well, is that enough? And I'd say most likely not. But I'd still want to classify that as evidence.
This may be a good point to segue to a general topic that would be good to close on, which is distinguishing the viewpoint that you have, Jacob, and that I have from the presuppositional approach to epistemology. And I think it's a good segue, because we were just talking about, well, what's the difference between Christian claim versus the Mormon claim versus the Muslim claim? And so what I want to do is let's aim to wrap this up at about the hour, and then that's where the recording ends. But then we can also, I'll be here and we can continue the discussion. There were several questions. We got some from Luke, from Ruben. that we want to maybe get to after. So let's go in this direction of how do we distinguish from what presuppositionalists such as James White or Durbin or Oliphant, Frame, Van Til, and so on. What is the difference between what you're saying, Jacob, and what they say?
Night and day. Okay. So here's a really important point to understand with presuppositionalism. Presuppositionalism doesn't reject reason per se. It rejects reason at the foundations. And that's really important. So presuppositionalists do use reason in their argumentation, and they affirm the use of reason in argumentation. The essential difference between presuppositionalism and classicalism isn't the use of reason. The essential difference is whether or not reason is at the foundations of our epistemology. And presuppositionalism says, no, you have to presuppose your foundation. So whatever the foundation is for your epistemology, presuppositionalism says you have to presuppose it. And they're going to say that foundation should be God. Either that God exists or that scripture is true or something along those lines. That they're going to differ between presuppositionalists on who says what there. But they're going to say the foundation has to be something about God or God's word, and there can be no reason supporting that for why you believe it. You just have to presuppose it. And the difference between what they're saying and what we're saying is, no, at the foundation is logic and sense perception, or combined, we would just call that reason. And there's good reason from those foundations to believe that God exists, that scripture is his word, etc. And so, if someone asked us, why do you believe that Christianity is true? Or why should I believe that Christianity is true? We would say, here are the reasons grounded in things like logic and sense perception. Whereas a presuppositionalist would say, you can't give reasons for it, you just have to presuppose it. And then in the context of presupposing it, you can employ arguments sort of as a persuasion technique, but ultimately you shouldn't rely on those arguments for your belief in it. You should just presuppose it and then kind of utilize the arguments as a persuasion technique.
Jacob, do you believe that this presuppositional approach amounts to, reduces to, implies subjectivism?
Yeah, because the ultimate question is, why do you presuppose Christianity rather than something else? Well, why presuppose the truth of Christianity or the truth of the Bible rather than the truth of the Quran or the truth of the Book of Mormon? Well, why presuppose that and not all these other things? And they can't give an answer for that. By definition, you can't give an answer for that, because as soon as you give an answer, then you're giving a reason for it, and then it's not presupposed. You're stepping into classicalism. So in order for it to be consistently presuppositional, you have to have it be an arbitrary presupposition. And if it's arbitrary, that means that ultimately your reason for selecting it rather than anything else is based on emotions. It's based on your preference for it rather than any objective reason for it. And so it's necessarily arbitrary and subjective and relativistic in that sense.
Mm-hmm. I saw an article where Greg Bahnsen gave I would say, the best possible defense of how he handles the question of comparing Christianity to Mormonism in Islam. And his answer was that you use internal coherence as an additional standard, which I'm confused about how he could do that. But so what he ended up saying is that the Quran claims that the Old Testament and New Testament are inspired, but it contradicts them, and therefore the Quran cannot be taken seriously. But what he's doing is he's presupposing that there must be a holy book, and he's doing that on the basis of the claim that we could not think logically unless there were revelation.
Yeah,
and this is a whole transcendental argument.
Yeah, and more importantly, he's presupposing that logic exists and is valid, and then using that as a standard for testing different ideas and different religious claims. And so what he's doing is he's functionally being a classicalist there. He's functionally using logic as his foundation and testing religious claims against that. But that's the big no-no according to presuppositionalism.
Yeah, as Trey pointed out, there is a distinction between metaphysics and epistemology, and we believe that what is happening with the precepts is they're confusing those two categories. And very many times when a presuppositionalist makes the argument, we say, well, we agree with that argument, but that's not a presuppositional argument. That's a classical argument.
Yep, exactly. So, and I think a lot of it comes down to presuppositionalists are confused about epistemology. They're not very careful thinkers. The way that they address these things is from a sort of pietistic, emotional framework of that feels really spiritual or that sounds really spiritual, so I'm going to believe it, rather than thinking really carefully and engaging honestly in discussions about it.
Well, we're on the hour. I think this is a good time to wrap up. I want to say thank you guys for joining on the call, and stick around because the call will continue, but I'm going to clip the video. But I wanted to say thank you to everybody that's watching this as a replay later. And all of our replays are available at christianintellectual.com/YouTube. I hope that you'll join us and subscribe to our podcast there, and that you'll consider getting in touch with us and telling us about the work that you're doing, because we believe that individual Christians need to be speaking out using online resources and in person to communicate about the necessity for truth, for objective truth. So see if we can help you out in that area. Thanks for joining us today.